So traditionally, psychiatric disorders have been viewed as distinct and categorical conditions. And while this has been useful for clinical decision-making, it also has some important limitations. One of these limitations is the important heterogeneity that exists among patients within the same diagnostic category, but also the large overlap in clinical symptoms, cognitive deficits, and genetic risk factors across diagnostic categories, and also the high comorbidity among disorders. And a transdiagnostic approach can help uncover underlying neurobiological mechanisms that transcend these diagnostic boundaries. So psychiatric disorders show disturbances of large-scale brain networks, and many studies have shown that especially high-order association brain networks, such as the control and default mode networks shown here in green, are disturbed in many psychiatric disorders. And while these findings have led to models of psychopathology, such as the triple network model, it has also led many studies to focus on these high-order association brain networks or specific regions such as the amygdala, and ignore large parts of the cortex. And so a data-driven approach might help taking a step back and look at the bigger picture, which might help foster novel insights about underlying processes. So in our study, we aim to identify transdiagnostic dimensions linking resting state functional connectivity in the whole brain to behavioral measures spanning clinical, cognitive, and personality domains. And we used a multivariate technique called partial least squares, or PLS, which finds the shared information between two data modalities by maximizing the covariance between those two modalities. And by looking at what's common across these psychiatric disorders, we're actually interested in what's shared among these disorders. But we're not saying that there's nothing unique to any of these psychiatric disorders. So we're using data from the UCLA Consortium for Neuropsychiatric Phenomics, and we have a sample of 224 subjects comprised of healthy individuals and individuals with ADHD, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and schizoaffective disorders. And these disorders may not be typically studied together, but the reasons they were selected is because they share deficits in response inhibition and in memory, which again is suggestive of some shared pathological processes. Because there were some differences in some of these demographic measures, we regressed out these potential confounds before running our analysis. And it's important to keep in mind that while we have these 5 diagnostic groups, our analysis actually ignores the group information, which we only use in post-hoc analysis for interpretation. So in our PLS analysis, on the imaging side, we have time series from resting state fMRI in 400 cortical regions from the Schaeffer Atlas, as well as 19 subcortical MRIs. And we compute the Pearson correlation between all pairs of brain regions, and then we vectorize the upper triangular matrix of this correlation matrix, and we store this into a matrix of size number of subjects by number of connections. And on the behavior side, we have 54 behavioral measures, including clinical symptoms, cognitive measures, as well as personality scores. And what we aim to find is brain behavior associations, which we refer to as components for the remainder of this talk. So we found 3 significant and robust components. The first component represents general psychopathology. The second component reflects cognitive dysfunction, and the third component is characterized by impulsivity. And what I'm showing you on these plots are the correlations between the functional connectivity between the functional connectivity and the behavioral subjects loadings in each of these components. And in different colors are shown the loadings of different groups, and we can see from these plots that the groups overlap quite largely, which shows that these dimensions are indeed they do indeed transcend diagnostic categories. And before I go into each of these components separately, I just want to demonstrate that not only were they significant, they were also robust. So we know that PLS tends to overfit, so we computed a five-fold cross-validation And we found that the three components linking general psychopathology, cognitive dysfunction, and impulsivity to functional connectivity patterns were significant, although the correlations were much lower. We also did a number of control analyses, for instance, computing COM-core instead of global signal regression, which is still controversial, and we found that the three components to be significant and to be significantly correlated to the loadings of our original model. We also recomputed our analysis in controls only and in patients only, and again found moderate to high correlations to our original model. And finally, we also recomputed our analysis on each of the two acquisition sites and found significant correlations for the three components. We were also wondering whether these three components were a specific feature of REST, or whether we could replicate this using task fMRI data. So this dataset includes data from 7 different fMRI tasks, and we computed functional connectivity within each of these tasks, and then averaged this functional connectivity across all tasks, and found, and we were able to successfully replicate the three components using task functional connectivity. So now back to our components. The first component is characterizes general psychopathology. And as we can see here, I'm showing here the top 20 behavioral loadings which drive this component. And we can see that it's mainly driven by clinical symptoms such as anxiety or depression, impulsivity, or psychotic symptoms such as perceptual aberrations and anhedonia. And while this component was mainly driven by clinical symptoms, it was also associated with lower scores on verbal memory. And on the right here is the imaging pattern that is associated with this behavioral model, pattern. And we see here connectivity loadings between 8 major resting state networks as well as subcortical regions. Then we masked this connectivity matrix to show only the within and between network connectivity loadings that were significant. And we see that with greater psychopathology, we found decreased connectivity within the somatomotor network, increased connectivity between the control network, dorsal attention, somatomotor and visual networks, and between those three networks and subcortical regions. And now if we look at the loadings of each group on this first component, we see that controls actually had lower loadings compared to all of the psychiatry groups, which is consistent with this component characterizing general psychopathology. So this component resembles what is called in the literature the P factor, which is supposed to reflect individuals' general liability to develop any form of psychopathology. And the fact that we found it across controls and patients supports the idea that psychopathology lies on a spectrum spanning healthy and disease states. Now the second component reflects cognitive dysfunction and is associated with lower scores on various cognitive measures, such as verbal and visual memory, executive functions, and while it's mainly characterized by cognitive dysfunction, it's not purely cognitive, as it's also associated with some clinical symptoms such as social anxiety or ADHD symptoms. So with higher cognitive dysfunction, we found increased connectivity within the somatomotor network, and increased connectivity between the default and control network, and decreased connectivity between the somatomotor and the default mode, control, and salience network. And on this component, schizophrenia patients had higher loadings compared to ADHD and bipolar patients, as well as controls, which is consistent with previous findings in the literature showing that schizophrenia patients are typically more impaired than other psychiatric groups. Our third component was characterized by various aspects of impulsivity, such as motor or attentional impulsivity, but also novelty seeking, false alarm rate, or a faster reaction time on a go/no-go task. And also by lower control abilities and lower harm avoidance. And with greater impulsivity, we found increased connectivity within the somatomotor network, and between the somatomotor network and the two attentional networks, and increased connectivity between the somatomotor and default and control networks, as well as between the somatomotor and subcortical regions. And on this component, we found that ADHD patients had higher loadings compared to schizophrenia patients and compared to controls, which is not surprising, knowing that ADHD is characterized by high levels of impulsivity and of hyperactivity. And impulsivity is an interesting, multifaceted construct that is central to many psychiatric disorders, not only ADHD, but also substance use disorder, for instance. Now, we were surprised to see the somatomotor network being so salient in our three components. So we decided to do a conjunction analysis, and we summed all the absolute loadings that were significant in all three components. And we found that indeed the somatomotor network was involved in all three components, both within network connectivity, but also connectivity between the somatomotor and the control network, the dorsal attention network, and the subcortical regions. And if we'll take a look, a closer look in what subcortical regions were involved, we found that it was mostly the caudate, thalamus, and cerebellum, and their connectivity with the somatomotor network that was involved across the three components. And finally, we also looked at the region level, and again found that it was the somatomotor regions that were implicated in the three components. So we went back to the literature, and we found that actually somatomotor network disconnectivity had often been reported, but rarely emphasized. And there's actually a lot of evidence for alterations in this network in schizophrenia patients, but also in schizoaffective disorder and in bipolar disorder. And these disturbances might be related to to deficits in motor processes, which are prevalent across many psychiatric disorders. And in fact, some of these motor disturbances are part of the diagnostic criteria in psychiatric disorders. For example, hyperactivity in ADHD, catatonia in schizophrenia, and psychomotor slowing in depression. And importantly, these motor deficits are present in unmedicated psychiatric patients also. So they're not only due to antipsychotic medication. We also found that these motor disturbances have previously been shown to precede disease onset and to predict disease progression, and they have also been linked to cognitive impairment. And the recognition of sensory motor abnormalities are increasingly recognized, as recently the sensory motor domain have been added to the research domain criteria framework, which is an initiative funded by the National Institute of Mental Health to promote dimensionally oriented approaches in psychiatry. And hopefully with this interest for the sensory motor domain, we can have a better understanding of the current psychopathology and of the risk for future psychiatric illness. So to wrap up, we found three components which might represent common underlying neurobiological processes and contribute to a biologically based classification of psychiatric disorders. And these three components have potential for clinical translation. They could, for example, be used to monitor treatment response in transdiagnostic protocols. We also found that the somatomotor functional connectivity was implicated in all three dimensions, and especially connectivity between the somatomotor and executive networks was prominent. So possible mechanisms could include impaired top-down control from executive networks to sensory networks, which might disturb sensory motor processes. Or alternatively, these deficits might start at the sensory level and cascade at the system, undermining higher order cognitive functions. So in conclusion, we identified three transdiagnostic dimensions with potential clinical application. We found that somatomotor disconnectivity was implicated in all three dimensions and possibly underlies sensory, motor, and motor disturbances, as well as higher order cognitive functions. And these data show the importance of a data-driven approach that considers the entire connectome that might help foster mechanistic insights in future studies. So with this, I'd like to thank my co-authors and the funding support of our lab. and also take a few seconds to acknowledge this repository for women in neuroscience, which is a great initiative to promote a better representation of women in neuroscience. Thank you for your attention.